When things at home are strained between a husband and wife, the man decides to check his home security cameras for answers. For weeks, his wife has been tired and moody, and even their dog has begun to act strangely. When he accesses the live footage, he's shocked to find out that his wife is sleeping with the dog, but he cries when he finds out the reason why. Once again, Tom was packing his bag for another 3 nights away for work. Ever since he'd been promoted, he was never home. Sarah admired her husband for all of his hard work, and she knew he was doing it all for them. But today she couldn't help but feel angry. Her job was far more laid back, and half the time she worked from home. Sometimes she just wished he would slow down a bit, and that they could spend more time together. She angrily bashed the keys on her laptop to drown out the sound of her husband rushing around the bedroom. He'd overslept, and now he was rushing. With the amount of time he spent away from home, Sarah didn't understand why he didn't just keep a bag packed permanently. By the time he'd finished packing and was ready to leave, Sarah was almost bubbling over with anger. She didn't normally mind him going away. She understood it was just part of the job and that things would settle down soon, so she couldn't explain where this sudden anger had come from. She was tired and grumpy, so as Tom kissed her goodbye and ran out the door, she barely even mumbled goodbye to him. That night, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She found her bad mood difficult to lift all day, so when the late afternoon rolled around, she logged off and ran herself a nice bath, hoping it would help. Feeling somewhat better about everything, she now regretted not saying goodbye properly, though she didn't even think Tom had noticed her bad mood. He'd been far too preoccupied with his trip. Rather than feeling angry, now she just felt sad. She climbed into bed and watched as Max, their elderly Rottweiler, tried to settle on his bed. Without thinking, she called his name and patted the bed. Max didn't know what to do at first. He'd never been allowed to sleep on the bed before. But when she patted the sheets again, he jumped up and almost immediately fell asleep with her. The next morning, Sarah awoke with the huge dog snuggled into her. She vowed not to tell Tom what she'd done, as they'd agreed long ago not to let Max sleep on the bed. There was no denying, though, that snuggling with the dog had lifted her loneliness and her mood. She stripped the bed sheets off and put them in the washer so her husband wouldn't see the dog hairs. Sarah's good mood didn't last long, though. By mid-morning, she was exhausted. Maybe sleeping with Max hadn't been quite as relaxing as she thought. That next night, she encouraged Max to stay on his bed, but the dog desperately wanted to be next to her. Apparently, he'd loved sleeping with her a little too much and was now missing the comfort of her arms around him. He spent the whole night whining, and Sarah was grumpier than ever. When Tom returned from his work trip, he didn't quite get the greeting he was expecting. Sarah was fast asleep on the sofa, even though it was only the middle of the afternoon, and Max was happily snoozing next to her, tucked in as close as he could get. The sight struck Tom as odd. He'd never known his wife to take an afternoon nap before, but clearly she needed the rest, so he left her to it. When she finally woke from her nap, she told Tom that the dog had been whining all night but left out the part where she'd probably caused the behavior by letting him sleep in their bed the day before. For the rest of the night, Tom tried to make light conversation with his wife, but she was quiet and reserved, and he put it down to her being tired. Thankfully, that evening Max settled straight into his bed and went to sleep, but things with Sarah were no better. The next day, when Tom came home from work, he had some bad news. He was being sent away again. Sarah exploded. Days of tiredness had pushed her over the edge, and she told her husband he spent more time working than he did at home. The couple argued all evening until eventually Sarah gave in and went to bed. Tom followed an hour later to find Max sitting right next to the bed, watching Sarah. He instructed the dog to get into his bed, which he did immediately, but the young man shook his head. What had gotten into everyone recently? Between Sarah's tiredness and bad moods, and Max's disobedience, things at home felt very unsettled. Little did Tom know that this was just the beginning, and when he returned home from his next work trip, things were even worse. The first night that her husband went away again, the young woman spent all evening tossing and turning in bed and getting up and down to the bathroom. If she carried on feeling this fatigued, she would have to go to the doctor, as she had no idea what could be causing it. The next night, she completely disregarded Tom's feelings about letting the dog onto the bed. She was desperate to sleep well, So once again she invited Max onto the bed to sleep with her. The giant dog immediately curled up next to her, and soon they were fast asleep. It was the best night's sleep Sarah had had in weeks. However, she was about to discover the reason for her tiredness. When Sarah and Tom had first got married, they'd been desperate to start a family. But 5 years on, they'd come to accept that they might never be parents to a biological child. It was part of the reason they'd adopted Max, and while they figured out their next move, the dog filled an empty hole in their lives. Sarah had found it hard to come to terms with their infertility, and it was only in the last few months that she truly started to feel like she was healing. She'd stopped doing pregnancy tests a long time ago, but now she found herself digging around in the bathroom cabinet to see if she still had any. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but before she dragged herself to the doctor's office, she just wanted to do a test herself. Finally pulling out a test from the back of the cabinet, she followed all the instructions like she'd done many times before and patiently waited. When the result finally popped up, Sarah fell to her knees in floods of tears. Woken up by her cries, Max went to check on his owner and spent the next 30 minutes with his chin on her lap and his head gently pressed into her stomach. When she finally dried her tears, she looked at the test again to be sure. Sarah was pregnant. The next few days passed by in a happy blur, but Sarah felt cautious too. She'd never once seen a positive result. As much as she was excited to tell Tom, she couldn't help feeling anxious that something bad would happen. She wished he was back at home to put her mind at rest. She began to think about how to break the news to him and what his reaction would be. That night, when she went to bed, she didn't even have to pat the sheets. Max jumped straight up and curled up next to her belly. It was almost as if he sensed he already had another little life to protect. She thought back to how Max had been behaving in the last few weeks and wondered if he'd sensed the change in her body even before she had. Sarah gently patted the dog and soon drifted off to sleep, her dreams full of Tom's happy reaction to the news. However, things didn't go to plan. When Tom returned from his trip, Sarah planned to tell him about the pregnancy almost immediately, but before she could break the news, he was already telling her that he was only home for one night. She felt like the wind had been knocked out of her sails as she stormed off and slammed the bedroom door behind her. She'd waited years to see a positive result on a pregnancy test, but how was she supposed to raise a child with a man who was never at home? Tom couldn't understand the reaction and looked at Max for support, but the huge dog blanked the man and instead sat outside Sarah's bedroom door, scratching to be let in. She swiftly opened the door and let the dog in, and Tom saw neither of them for the rest of the evening. Max had always been close to both his owners. It had been Sarah's idea to adopt an older dog, keen to give him a happy life in what could be his last few years. The Rottweiler was outliving all their expectations, though, and now he seemed to have formed an extremely close bond with Sarah, barely taking any notice of Tom when he was home. The young man was getting fed up with both how his wife and dog had changed in recent weeks, especially because he couldn't understand why. By the time he left for his next trip, Sarah still hadn't spoken to him. He had no idea that it was hormones wreaking havoc with her sleep and mood, as she hadn't had the chance to tell him about the pregnancy. All day, Tom thought about how much life at home had changed recently. Maybe he should speak to his boss about cutting down on his work trips. The problem was, it was a crucial time for the business. He knew that in a couple of months things would settle down, but he had no idea if his marriage would even last that long. There had to be a reason for Sarah's moods and Max's odd behavior. Suddenly, the young man remembered the cameras he'd installed. He didn't know if they worked, as he'd never even looked at them since installing them. But if they did, they might just give him some answers about his altered home life. He felt nervous as he turned his computer on. What was he going to see? He didn't think Sarah was cheating on him or doing something bad, but the nagging feeling that he'd missed something important during these last few weeks made his blood run cold. Had he misread some signals? Was her bad mood any indication that she might want to leave him? He shook his head vigorously, trying to keep his wits about him, assuming the worst would only drive him crazy. He would check the cameras and put his mind at ease, even though he felt sorry about the huge invasion of privacy he was about to commit. Opening the app on his laptop, he watched the live stream. Sarah was pottering around the bedroom, tidying up and getting ready for bed. He suddenly found himself feeling extremely sad. Why were things going wrong between them? They used to be best friends and laugh all the time. But these days it seemed that all the joy had been sucked right out of their marriage. But he still loved her, and he knew she loved him back. This had to be just a phase. He would fight hard for things to get back to normal. But just as he was wondering how to salvage his relationship, he saw something that shocked him. Max jumped straight up onto the bed as soon as Sarah climbed in, and dozed off almost immediately. Had she been letting the dog sleep in their bed when he was away? It would certainly go some way toward explaining the dog's sudden attachment to his wife. He couldn't take his eyes off the screen. He should be angry since both of them had agreed never to let Max on the bed. However, it seemed that Sarah was not only allowing him on the bed, but letting him sleep there the whole night. But then she did something else that left him shocked. He watched as Sarah lovingly placed her hands on her stomach and softly rubbed. He'd never seen that before. It reminded him of an action that an expectant mother might do. But then he watched as Max gently laid his head on Sarah's stomach. He saw his wife's lips move, but the volume was turned down. He frantically hit the volume button and replayed the clip. Tears streamed down his face as he heard his wife say to their dog, "Say hello to your brother or sister." Sarah was pregnant. That was the happiest news he could ever receive. Apparently, Max could sense it, and that's why he'd been so protective over her lately. But why hadn't she said anything to him? Tom cut his trip short, telling his boss he had family matters to deal with. On his way home, he bought the biggest bunch of flowers he could find. As soon as he got home, he scooped his wife up into a giant hug. When he finally let her go, he gently touched her belly and told her he knew about the pregnancy. At first, Sarah was shocked that he used the cameras to watch her, but then she realized just how silly they'd both been in the last few weeks and immediately forgave him. This was no time for fighting. They were expecting a baby, something that they never thought would happen. Even Max got some extra fuss from the young man for looking after Sarah. As the pregnancy progressed, Max could no longer sleep with Sarah. There just wasn't room in the bed for her growing belly, Tom, and a giant dog. But he was still as close by as he could be. What a sweet ending. How would you have reacted to the camera footage? Do you think Max could sense the pregnancy? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.